Most people spend their entire lives surrounded by individuals who slowly poison their spirit, and they never even realize it's happening. I've observed this tragedy for over 50 years. The unconscious mind attracts exactly what it needs to learn from, but if you don't wake up to the lesson, you become a prisoner of other people's unresolved darkness. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The negative people in your life aren't accidents. They're there because some unconscious part of you believes you deserve their treatment, or because they're reflecting something you desperately need to integrate. But once you understand the psychology behind these toxic dynamics, projection, shadow work, and psychic energy, everything changes. You stop being a victim. You start becoming conscious. And consciousness, my friend, is the only real protection you'll ever need. Before we start, if you genuinely enjoy these videos, consider subscribing to our channel and comment what city and time you're watching from. I'm really curious where everyone is tuning in from. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You've heard advice before about cutting toxic people out of your life, and perhaps you've tried it. Perhaps you've walked away from someone who drained you, only to find yourself in another relationship that feels eerily similar. Or maybe you're stuck right now, knowing someone is bad for you but unable to create distance. You feel guilty. You feel obligated. You feel somehow responsible for their well-being, even as your own vitality slowly dies. I want you to know something. I understand. I've spent 5 decades working with people just like you, brilliant souls who couldn't figure out why they kept attracting the same painful dynamics. And I've experienced this myself, the confusion of being entangled with someone whose presence feels like a slow suffocation, yet feeling powerless to change it. But here's what I discovered through years of studying the unconscious mind. These relationships aren't random. They're not bad luck. They're psychological mirrors. And until you understand what they're reflecting, you'll keep recreating the same pattern with different faces. Today, I'm going to share with you a framework that goes far deeper than simply removing negative people. We're going to explore why they're in your life in the first place, what your unconscious mind is trying to tell you through these painful connections, and how to transform from someone who unconsciously attracts toxicity into someone who consciously chooses relationships that support your growth. This isn't about becoming cold or shutting people out. It's about developing consciousness. It's about understanding the invisible psychological forces that have been running your relationships without your awareness. And it's about reclaiming the psychic energy, the life force that you've been unconsciously giving away to people who cannot appreciate it. We're going to look at projection, the shadow, psychic energy, and the process I call individuation, becoming truly yourself. And by the end, you'll have practical tools you can use immediately to shift these dynamics. But I must tell you up front, this requires honesty, brutal honesty with yourself, because the most difficult truth you'll face today is this: you've been participating in your own suffering, not because you're weak, not because you're broken, but because you've been unconscious to certain patterns. And the moment you become conscious, everything changes. So, let me take you back to something I witnessed countless times in my practice. I had a patient once, let's call her Anna, who came to me utterly exhausted. She described her mother as relentlessly critical, her closest friend as subtly manipulative, and her romantic partner as emotionally unavailable. Every session, she would recount their failures, their cruelties. Right, these people were difficult. They were negative. But as I listened, I began to notice something. Anna wasn't just describing other people. She was describing a pattern, the same pattern, repeated across different relationships. And that's when I knew this wasn't about them. This was about something unconscious in Anna that was attracting and tolerating this treatment. So one day, I asked her a question that initially seemed to offend her. I said, "Anna, what if these people aren't in your life by accident? What if they're there because some unconscious part of you needs them to be? What if they're showing you something about yourself that you cannot yet see? She looked at me with a mixture of hurt and anger. Are you saying this is my fault? She asked. No, I said. I'm saying you're unconscious to why this keeps happening. And until you become conscious, you'll remain trapped. That conversation began a long journey for Anna, a journey into what I call shadow work, and by the end of it, she understood something profound. The negative people in her life were mirrors, reflecting parts of herself she had disowned, rejected, and pushed into her unconscious mind. They weren't just toxic individuals. They were psychological teachers, showing her exactly what she needed to integrate to become whole. Now, let me explain what I mean by this, because it's the foundation of everything we'll discuss today. You see, every human being has what I call a shadow. The shadow is the part of your psyche that contains everything you've deemed unacceptable about yourself. The traits, impulses, emotions, and qualities you learned early in life were bad, wrong, or shameful. Maybe you learned that anger was unacceptable, so you pushed it down into your unconscious. Maybe you learned that ambition was selfish, so you disowned that part of yourself. Maybe vulnerability was seen as weakness, so you locked it away where no one could see it. Not even you. But here's the thing about the shadow. It doesn't disappear just because you've disowned it. It lives in your unconscious mind, and it influences your behavior in ways you cannot see. And one of the primary ways the shadow operates is through projection. Projection is a psychological mechanism where you take something inside yourself that you cannot accept and unconsciously project it outward onto other people. You see in them what you cannot see in yourself, and then you react to them as if the problem is out there, when really, you're reacting to a disowned part of your own psyche. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone who learned in childhood that expressing needs was selfish and burdensome. They develop a shadow around neediness. They disown that part of themselves and pride themselves on being independent and self-sufficient. But what happens? They find themselves constantly surrounded by needy people, needy partners, needy friends, needy colleagues, and they feel endlessly drained by these relationships. Why? Because they're projecting their own disowned neediness onto others. The unconscious mind is actually trying to bring that rejected part of themselves into consciousness by surrounding them with mirrors of it. But if they don't recognize this, they just keep feeling victimized by all these needy people, never realizing they're reacting to their own rejected self. This is the uncomfortable truth about negative people in your life. Very often, they're carrying something that belongs to you. Some shadow material you've refused to integrate, and your unconscious mind has attracted them specifically so you can see it, own it, and integrate it back into your psyche. Now, I need to be clear here. Not every negative person in your life is a projection. Some people are genuinely toxic. Some people are operating from their own unintegrated shadow, and they will harm you if you let them. The difference is this. If someone triggers you emotionally, if you have a strong reaction to them, if you feel pulled into their drama, that's often a sign of projection. But if you can observe someone's behavior with calm clarity and simply recognize it's not healthy for you without strong emotional charge, that's different. That's discernment, not projection. The key is learning to tell the difference, and that requires consciousness. It requires the willingness to look inside yourself and ask, what am I reacting to? What does this person represent that I've rejected in myself? Anna began doing this work. Every time she felt triggered by her critical mother, she'd pause and ask, where am I critical of myself? Where have I internalized this critical voice? And slowly, she realized she had her mother's voice living inside her own mind. She was incredibly harsh with herself, constantly judging her own choices, her appearance, her worthiness. Her mother's external criticism was just a mirror of her own internal critic. And here's what happened when she integrated this. She began to develop compassion for herself. She started noticing when the critical voice arose and choosing a kinder response. And as she did this internal work, something remarkable happened. Her mother's criticism didn't stop, but it no longer affected her the same way. It no longer drained her energy. She could hear it, recognize it for what it was, and choose not to internalize it. That's the power of consciousness. When you integrate your shadow, you stop giving your power away to the people who embody it. But there's another dimension to this that we must explore, and that's the concept of psychic energy. I spent much of my career studying what I call libido, but not in the narrow sexual sense that Freud used. I mean your life force, your vitality, your essential energy. This energy is real. You can feel it. When you're around certain people, you feel enlivened, inspired, more yourself. When you're around others, you feel depleted, heavy, drained. This isn't imagination. It's a genuine energetic exchange happening beneath your conscious awareness. And negative people, people who haven't done their own psychological work, often function as what we might call energy vampires. They draw on your energy to fill their own emptiness. They haven't developed the capacity to generate their own sense of vitality, so they unconsciously take it from others. Now, they're not doing this maliciously. In most cases, they're not conscious of it. They're operating from their own wounds, their own lack of integration. But the effect on you is real. Every interaction drains you because you're unconsciously giving your energy away. And here's the critical question. Why do you allow it? Because you do have a choice. You may not realize it, but you do. The reason you allow your energy to be drained is because, on some unconscious level, you believe you should. Maybe you learned that being a good person means sacrificing yourself for others. Maybe you equate love with self-abandonment. Maybe you believe you don't deserve to have boundaries, or that setting boundaries is selfish or cruel. These are unconscious beliefs, and they govern your behavior without your awareness. They're why you keep tolerating relationships that exhaust you. You think you're being kind, being patient, being understanding. But really, you're betraying yourself. You're allowing someone else's unresolved psychology to consume your life force. Let me tell you about another pattern I observed repeatedly. It's what I call the repetition compulsion. This is the unconscious tendency to recreate the same painful dynamics over and over, hoping that this time, the outcome will be different. It's why people who grew up with a critical parent often choose critical partners. It's why someone abandoned in childhood keeps attracting people who disappear. The unconscious mind is trying to resolve old wounds by recreating them. It believes, on some level, that if you can, just get this person to love you, approve of you, stay with you, it will heal the original wound. But it never works, because the person you're trying to win over isn't the person who originally wounded you. And even if they change, it won't touch that old pain. The only way to heal is to turn inward, to see the pattern, to grieve the original wound, and to stop reenacting it with new people. This requires consciousness. It requires you to step back from your automatic reactions and ask, why does this feel so familiar? What old story am I replaying? And when you see it clearly, you can choose differently. You can stop giving your energy to people who represent unfinished business from your past. Now, let's talk about individuation, because this is the ultimate purpose of all this work. Individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are, of differentiating yourself from the collective expectations, from your family conditioning, from the unconscious patterns that have been running your life. It's the journey toward wholeness. And here's what I've learned. You cannot individuate while you're enmeshed in toxic relationships. You cannot become yourself when you're constantly adapting to someone else's dysfunction, managing their emotions, walking on eggshells around their reactivity. These relationships keep you small. They keep you in a false self. A self that exists only to manage the other person. True relationships support your individuation. They give you space to grow, to change, to discover who you are. They don't require you to abandon yourself to keep the peace. And when a relationship does require that, when being in connection means betraying your own truth, that's when you know it's time to create distance. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. Creating distance isn't just about physically removing someone from your life, though sometimes that's necessary. It's about psychological differentiation. It's about recognizing where you end and they begin. It's about reclaiming your energy, your autonomy, your right to have boundaries. This can happen even if you're still in contact with the person. You can differentiate internally. You can stop taking on their emotions. You can stop believing their criticisms define you. You can remain present without being enmeshed. But this requires tremendous consciousness. Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine you're standing in front of a mirror. The mirror reflects your image, but it's not you. You are separate from the reflection. Now, most people, when they encounter negative individuals, forget this. They merge with the reflection. They believe the criticism. They absorb the negativity. They take on the other person's emotional state as if it's their own. But when you become conscious, you remember, that's a reflection, not reality. You can observe it without merging with it. You can acknowledge, this person is critical, without believing, therefore, I am flawed. You can witness their pain without taking it on as your own. This is differentiation. This is psychological freedom, and this is what allows you to set boundaries without guilt, without anger, without needing the other person to change or validate your choice. Let me take you deeper into the collective patterns at play here, because your personal psychology doesn't exist in isolation. You're part of what I call the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. And within this collective unconscious live archetypes, universal patterns of human experience. When you're in a toxic relationship, you're often playing out an archetypal drama. The tyrant and the victim. The rescuer and the wounded child. The narcissist and the empath. These aren't just personal dynamics. They're ancient patterns that human beings have been enacting for millennia. And here's the thing about archetypes. When you're unconscious, they possess you. You become the victim, or the rescuer, or the martyr, and you lose yourself in the role. You can't see beyond it. You think this is just who you are, or just how relationships work. But when you become conscious of the archetype, you free yourself from its grip. You can recognize, I'm playing the rescuer again. I'm trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and I'm exhausting myself in the process. And in that moment of recognition, you have choice. You can step out of the role. You can refuse to play the part. This is incredibly liberating, because it means you're not doomed to repeat these patterns forever. You're just unconscious to them. And consciousness changes everything. Now, let's talk about what consciousness actually looks like in practice. Because all of this theory is useless if you can't apply it to your daily life. So, I want to give you specific tools you can use starting today to shift your relationship with negative people. The first practice is what I call the shadow inventory. Every day, I want you to pay attention to who triggers you emotionally. Not just mildly annoys you, but really triggers you. Strong anger, resentment, judgment, disgust, Write down what it is about them that bothers you so much. Be specific. They're so selfish. They're always playing the victim. They're manipulative. They're weak. Now, here's the hard part. Take each one of those judgments and ask yourself, is there any way this trait exists in me? Even a little bit? Even in a form I don't want to admit? You're looking for your shadow here. The disowned parts of yourself that you project onto others. And you might resist this. You might think, no, I'm nothing like them. But I'm asking you to look deeper. Maybe you're not selfish in the same way, but do you ever prioritize your needs? Do you ever want something just for yourself? That's not bad, that's human. But if you've labeled all self-interest as selfish and pushed it into your shadow, you'll judge it harshly in others. The goal isn't to excuse their behavior. The goal is to reclaim your projection, to own the parts of yourself you've rejected, because when you do, they lose their power over you. You stop being triggered. You can see the person clearly without the distortion of your own shadow. The second practice is energy awareness. Before and after you spend time with someone, check in with yourself. How do you feel? What's happening in your body? Do you feel light or heavy? Energized or drained? Is your chest tight? Is your stomach knotted? Are you exhausted? Your body knows the truth before your mind does. It's responding to the energetic exchange happening beneath your awareness. So, start tracking these patterns. Notice who consistently drains you and who enlivens you. And then ask yourself, am I willing to keep giving my energy to people who deplete me? This isn't about judgment. Some people are going through difficult times and need extra support that's different. I'm talking about chronic patterns. People who always take and never give. People who leave you feeling empty every single time. The third practice is conscious boundary setting. And this is where most people struggle, because they confuse boundaries with cruelty. They think setting a boundary means you don't care about the person, or you're being selfish, or you're abandoning them. But boundaries aren't walls built from fear or anger. They're sacred spaces created from self-knowledge. They're you saying, I honor myself enough to protect my energy. I respect my own growth enough to limit relationships that prevent it. And here's how you do it. Consciously. You don't set boundaries in the heat of anger or resentment. You do it from a place of clarity. You notice the pattern. You recognize it's not serving your growth. And then, calmly and firmly, you create space. This might sound like, I've realized this relationship isn't healthy for me right now. I need to take some distance. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to convince them. You're not asking permission. You're informing them of your choice. And yes, they might react badly. They might guilt you, accuse you of being selfish, try to manipulate you into staying. That's their unconscious trying to maintain the dynamic. But you're not responsible for managing their reaction. You're only responsible for your own consciousness and your own choices. The fourth practice is projection recall. When you're triggered by someone, pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, what am I projecting here? What part of myself am I seeing in them that I've disowned? This is advanced work. It requires you to interrupt your automatic reaction and turn inward. But it's incredibly powerful. Because the moment you reclaim a projection, you reclaim your energy. You're no longer giving your power away to an external person. You're bringing it back inside yourself, where it belongs. And you can even dialogue with this projected part. If you're judging someone for being weak, have a conversation with the weak part of yourself. Ask it, what do you need? What are you trying to tell me? Sue. NR. 2. You might discover that what you call weakness is actually vulnerability, sensitivity, a need for rest. And there's nothing wrong with those things. They're human. The fifth practice is daily differentiation. This is about remembering who you are, separate from other people's opinions, expectations, and emotions. Every morning, set an intention. Today, I choose consciousness. Today, I will notice when I'm merging with someone else's state, and I will differentiate. Throughout the day, practice this. When someone is angry, notice if you're taking on their anger. When someone is anxious, notice if you're absorbing their anxiety. And then consciously separate. Remind yourself, that's their emotion. It doesn't belong to me. I can be present with them without carrying their burden. This is especially important if you're an empathic person, someone who naturally attunes to others' feelings. You've probably spent your whole life taking on other people's emotional states without realizing it. But empathy doesn't require you to lose yourself. You can feel with someone without becoming them. And finally, the sixth practice is integration ritual. Every evening, take a few minutes to reflect. What did you learn today? Where did you see your shadow? Where did you set a boundary? Where did you reclaim your energy? And here's the key. Approach this with gratitude, even when it's painful. If someone triggered you, be grateful for the mirror. If you recognized a projection, celebrate the consciousness. This isn't about perfection. It's about the gradual, steady journey toward wholeness. You might even say to yourself, "Thank you for showing me what I needed to see. I'm integrating this part of myself. I'm becoming more whole." This transforms the entire experience from victimhood to empowerment. Now, let's address something important. As you do this work, you might feel guilt. You might worry you're being selfish, abandoning people who need you, becoming cold or uncaring. This is normal. It's the voice of your conditioning. The old belief that being good means sacrificing yourself. But I want you to understand something. You cannot help anyone from a place of depletion. You cannot guide someone else toward consciousness if you're unconscious yourself. And you cannot love others authentically if you've abandoned yourself. The most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to become conscious, to do your shadow work, to set boundaries, to choose relationships that support your growth. Because when you do this, you stop participating in unconscious dynamics that harm everyone involved. When you refuse to play the victim, you stop enabling the tyrant. When you refuse to rescue, you stop preventing someone from learning to save themselves. When you set boundaries, you teach others that they must respect them. This is actually an act of love, even when it doesn't feel that way. And here's something I've observed over decades. When you change, the relationship either transforms or it ends. Sometimes, when you become conscious and set boundaries, the other person rises to meet you. They respect your limits. They start doing their own work. The relationship evolves into something healthier, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they resist. They push back. They try to pull you back into the old dynamic. And that's when you know the relationship was built on unconscious patterns, not genuine connection. It can only exist if you remain small, if you keep playing your role, if you sacrifice yourself. And in those cases, ending the relationship isn't cruelty, it's consciousness. It's you choosing growth over stagnation, truth over pretense, your authentic self over a false persona created to manage someone else's dysfunction. This is painful. I won't pretend it isn't. It's painful to recognize you've been unconscious. It's painful to see the patterns you've been repeating. It's painful to set boundaries with people you care about. It's painful to walk away from relationships that no longer serve you. But you know what's more painful? Spending your entire life unconscious, never becoming who you truly are. giving your precious life force to people who cannot appreciate it, dying with your potential unrealized because you were too afraid to set boundaries, too guilty to choose yourself, too unconscious to see the prison you were living in. I've seen both paths. I've seen people who chose consciousness, who did the hard work of shadow integration, who set boundaries despite the guilt, who walked away from toxic relationships even when it hurt. And I've seen people who remained unconscious their entire lives, perpetually drained, perpetually suffering, perpetually hoping that others would change while never changing themselves. The conscious path is harder in the short term, but it leads to freedom. The unconscious path is easier in the moment. You just keep tolerating, keep adapting, keep shrinking, but it leads to a slow death of the spirit. You get to choose. That's the empowering truth I want you to take from this. You are not a victim of other people's toxicity. You're an unconscious participant in dynamics you don't yet understand. And the moment you become conscious, you reclaim your power. Let me tell you what happened to Anna, the patient I mentioned earlier. After months of shadow work, after recognizing her projections, after learning to set boundaries from a place of consciousness rather than reactivity, she did something remarkable. She didn't dramatically cut everyone out of her life. She didn't burn bridges or make grand pronouncements. Instead, she quietly began to change. She stopped responding to her mother's criticism with defensiveness or hurt. She simply observed it, recognized it for what it was, and chose not to internalize it. She stopped trying to fix her emotionally unavailable partner, and instead asked herself why she was choosing unavailability. She realized she was afraid of true intimacy, so she'd unconsciously chosen someone who couldn't give it. Once she saw this, she ended the relationship not with anger, but with clarity. And her manipulative friend, Anna, set a boundary. She said, "I've noticed this pattern between us, and it's not working for me anymore. I need to take some space." The friend reacted badly, tried to guilt her. And Anna felt that pull, that old urge to apologize, to take it back, to sacrifice herself to keep the peace. But she didn't. She held the boundary. And you know what happened? The friend eventually disappeared from her life. And Anna felt sad about it, because there had been good moments, genuine connection at times. But she also felt relief, spaciousness, freedom. She had her energy back. And then something beautiful happened. As Anna became more conscious, as she integrated her shadow and set healthier boundaries, she began attracting different people, people who respected her limits, people who had done their own psychological work, people who enlivened rather than drained her. She told me once, near the end of our work together, "I used to think I was unlucky with people. I thought I just kept meeting toxic individuals. But now I see I was unconsciously choosing them. I was playing out old patterns, trying to heal old wounds. Not because people out there changed, but because I changed who I allowed close to me." That's the transformation I want for you. Not a life of isolation or distrust, but a life of conscious choice. Relationships that support your growth, that honor your energy, that allow you to become who you truly are. And this doesn't mean your relationships will be perfect. It doesn't mean you'll never be challenged or uncomfortable. Growth requires challenge, but there's a difference between relationships that challenge you to grow and relationships that drain you while keeping you small. You must learn to tell the difference. Conscious relationships ask you to be more yourself, more honest, more whole. Toxic relationships ask you to be less authentic, less boundaried, less alive. One expands you, the other diminishes you. So, as we come to the end of our time together, I want to leave you with this. The negative people in your life aren't your enemies. They're your unconscious teachers. They're showing you shadow material you need to integrate, patterns you need to break, boundaries you need to set. But the lesson isn't to tolerate their toxicity. The lesson isn't to sacrifice yourself on the altar of being understanding or patient or kind. The lesson is to wake up, to see why they're there, to reclaim your projections, to integrate your shadow, and then, from a place of consciousness, to choose who gets access to your precious energy. Boundaries aren't walls built from fear. They're sacred spaces created from self-knowledge. They're you saying to the universe, I know who I am. I honor my growth. I respect my energy. And I will no longer betray myself to make others comfortable. This is the path of individuation. This is the journey toward wholeness. And it requires courage. The courage to look inside yourself honestly. The courage to own what you've disowned. The courage to set boundaries even when it feels uncomfortable. The courage to walk away from relationships that prevent you from becoming who you truly are. But I promise you, it's worth it. Because on the other side of this work is freedom. Not the freedom from difficult people, they'll always exist, but the freedom from being controlled by them. The freedom to choose consciously rather than react unconsciously. The freedom to live from your authentic self rather than a false persona created to manage other people's dysfunction. You are not here to be small. You're not here to sacrifice your potential to make others comfortable. You're not here to drain yourself trying to fill people who refuse to do their own inner work. You're here to become conscious, to individuate, to discover who you truly are beneath all the conditioning and the patterns and the unconscious beliefs. And every time you set a boundary, every time you reclaim a projection, every time you choose consciousness over comfort, you take another step on that path. It's not easy, but nothing worth doing ever is. So I'll leave you with this affirmation, this reminder that you can return to whenever you doubt yourself. I am conscious. I am sovereign. I choose growth over comfort, awareness over avoidance, and the courage to become who I truly am. I honor my energy. I set boundaries from love, not fear, and I trust that as I become more conscious, I will naturally attract relationships that support my wholeness. Remember, consciousness is a journey, not a destination. You won't get this perfect. You'll slip back into old patterns sometimes. You'll doubt yourself. You'll feel guilty for setting boundaries. That's all part of the process. What matters is that you keep choosing awareness. You keep doing the work. You keep moving toward wholeness. And if this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more psychological insights. Hit like to support this work, and drop a comment sharing your own experience with toxic relationships. I'd love to hear what you're learning about yourself. What patterns are you recognizing? Where are you setting boundaries? What shadow material are you integrating? Share your journey, because your consciousness inspires consciousness in others. Thank you for walking this path with me. Thank you for having the courage to look inside yourself honestly. Conscious people, more individuals who have done their inner work and can show up in relationships with authenticity, with boundaries, with compassion that doesn't require self-abandonment. You are on your way. Trust the process. Honor yourself. And never forget, consciousness is the only real protection you'll ever need.